everybody, and welcome to yet another interesting conversation in our series of conversations with interesting people from software development. And my guest today is somebody who has 21 years of software engineering experience. She does a lot of teaching and mentoring. She likes XP practices, clean architecture, solid principles, DevOps. And I learned that she's also a published author for a novel, so that's something, while being a math graduate. So very interesting combination uh, of different traits. That's why I'm very eager to chat today with Clare Sudbery. Welcome, Clare.
Hello, I'm very happy to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
So I have to say that I first learned about you and we were looking for speakers for iTechCon conference, and we found your profile and it looked very interesting. And what I like to do is to ask everybody who is joining us in this channel first to tell us a few words of how they got into programming. What brought you into this industry? Why did you start writing code?
I did a degree in maths, as you mentioned. So I actually studied for a joint honours degree in maths and philosophy. And I had thought that my life plan was that I was going to graduate with a degree in maths, and then I was going to become a maths teacher in high schools. And then while I was at university, I had several friends who were teachers, and they put me off. They said, teaching isn't what you think it's going to be. There's a lot of bureaucracy. There's a lot of stress. It's not the job that you think it's going to be. So I changed my mind about becoming a teacher, but I didn't really have anything to replace it. And I didn't want to do any of the other things that people tend to do with maths degrees. I didn't want to work in finance. In any shape or form, really, and really the main things that people tended to do with maths degrees were accounting, stock market, or teaching. So I didn't know what to do, and I ended up working for our local council as a housing officer. So I was helping to administer public housing. But while I was doing that, I had a boyfriend who was a games programmer. So he wrote computer games. And I thought to myself, why am I not doing that? Why am I not working with computers? But there was one very obvious reason why I wasn't working with computers, which is that I knew nothing about computers. So I'm quite old. And when I was at university, computers were not routinely used. And although I did do half of a maths degree, because the scheduling was required in order for me to mix maths with philosophy, one of the things that got dropped was the computing element. So I didn't do any computing in my degree. And also, it was not even unusual that I wrote all of my essays with a pen on a piece of paper. I didn't use a word processor. I wasn't using a computer for anything. And I had owned a ZX Spectrum when I was a child, and I had briefly been a member of the computer club at high school. But apart from that, I really had no experience of computers. But what I was thinking was, I would definitely have the aptitude for that. I'm a very logical, analytical thinker. I'm very organized. I love the idea of computers. The brief kind of skirmishes I've had with them have been really enjoyable. So I quit my job as a housing officer. I went back to university and I did a 12-month master's in computation. And it was designed as a conversion course. So it was designed to take people who had non-computing degrees and effectively convert them into computer graduates. And the course was split roughly 50-50 between programming and analysis in very broad terms. And I found that programming, actually writing code, was the thing that I loved. That was the thing I was really excited by. And it wasn't difficult from there to walk straight into my first job as a software engineer. So a lot of employers were coming to the recruitment fairs at the university, and they were deliberately targeting us to go and work for them. So it wasn't at all hard for me to then get my first job as a software engineer.
So what was your first programming language and your first paradigm? C++.
Yeah, C++, object oriented. I graduated from my master's in 1995. So, yes, it was the academic year 94-95. Object oriented programming, certainly as it was described by our lecturer, and I know that universities are often behind industry, but from his point of view in academia, object-oriented programming was a new, shiny, exciting, cutting-edge thing, and he was teaching it to us. And so he very much taught C++ and object-oriented programming. And that was how I came out of that, was equipped as a C++ software engineer. And my first job, that was the language that I was coding in. Although we did also very quickly start using Pascal, because we were using Delphi, the Ball and Delphi product. So I also learned some Pascal as well. So it was kind of, I think still more C++ than Pascal, but there was quite a lot of Pascal in the mix as well.
And how was programming back then? Was it structured? Did you work in a small team, in a large team? Did you receive the tasks and you had to do them? Or was there any conversation around design or anything?
Yeah, it was very different. I mean, it was waterfall, but we didn't call it waterfall. We just thought that was how you developed software. I now know that there were people all the way back then who were beginning to think about agile, but I was completely oblivious to any of that. But we were a great team. Funnily enough, I this week was swapping messages with my team lead at the time, who was saying, and has always said in the 20 years since, 25 years actually, that was the best team he ever worked with. And it was a great team. We worked well together. You know, sometimes when you get to that kind of, the forming, storming and norming, when you get to a high performing team, we were a good team. We did work well together. So we talked to each other a lot about what we were doing. But typically the way that work was structured was the work would come via our team lead, who would be involved in design to some extent, and he would be liaising with the business, and then he would pass the work to us. But typically you would be given a piece of work which you would work on for several weeks. So it would be a large piece of work which you would be personally responsible for, and then you would be integrating that work with the work that your colleagues were doing. Or you might be bug fixing, in which case it would be a much smaller piece of work. But we did communicate very well with one another, which wasn't so true of the next job that I worked on, where it was much more, I was given a piece of work and I'd just go off and do it on my own. And there was less collaboration, I think. Yeah. But definitely waterfall.
This matches my early experiences as well. It was also interesting in Romania that there was no, when the industry started, it started after the 1990s, after the revolution, because before that it was fundamentally, computers were forbidden, let's say, more or less. Then everybody was equal in the sense that nobody had the experience of project management. Nobody had the experience of team leaders. And so the teams got structured after a while, but it was kind of the same idea. And a lot of things were focused on the technical knowledge that indeed many people had, because we were all passionate. That's why we got into this field, because we were passionate at that time. So when was your first time when you heard about XP practices or applied them?
A long time later. So I was in the industry. So, but the reason that you might have, people very eagle-eyed and attuned to numbers might have noticed that you introduced me as somebody with 21 years of experience. And yet I'm saying that this first job was 25 plus years ago. And that's because there was a gap in my career. And what happened was I was a software engineer for 12 years. So 4 years in that first job I talked about, and then a brief stint at another company, and then 7 years at another company. And at the end of that 7-year period, I was made redundant. And by that time, I had lost interest really in software engineering. It was just the thing that put food on the table. It was just my job that I sort of tolerated, to be honest. And I think I'd like to kind of dwell on that a little bit, because I think part of the reason I wasn't motivated was that it wasn't highly collaborative, and we were quite atomized. We weren't highly collaborative in the way that we weren't pairing. And I had, towards the end of that time, I can't remember if it was before I was made redundant or afterwards, but around that time, I do remember hearing people talking about pair programming. And I thought, I kind of had to do a double take and check that I was hearing what I thought I was hearing. So, what? You're telling me that two people sit together at the same computer and work on the same piece of code at the same time? I thought it was insane. I also thought it sounded like torture. I thought it sounded like really deeply unpleasant. And I thought it sounded ridiculously inefficient. Why would you pay two people to do one job? And also, why would anybody want to be shackled to another person at their desk? And I had a very kind of personal relationship with my computer. I quite liked the fact that I only ever had to talk to a computer and I didn't have to talk to people. I would deliberately, whenever I was moved to a new desk, I would very carefully try to arrange things so that I had my back to a wall and the back of my computer faced outwards so that people couldn't see what I was doing. And I thought that was something fundamental to me. But what I now realise is that all of the way that our work was set up, we were very encouraged to be atomized and very protective of our own work. And what was the fundamental problem there was a deep insecurity that I thought if anybody else could see what I was doing, they would be appalled and think that I was rubbish. And they try and interfere as well. This idea that this is mine, this is my little world, and I don't want anyone else getting involved in it. So what changed? I left the industry for 4 years. When I was made redundant, I had no interest in finding another job. So I actually became a freelance writer briefly. And then I retrained as a high school maths teacher. And I finally did do that thing that I thought I'd wanted to do many years earlier. I became a maths teacher. And I thought I was walking into it with my eyes wide open, but it was not a successful period of my life. My main problem was that I was not very good at behaviour management. I was way too sympathetic to the plight of my poor teenage students and not very good at laying down the law. And also the way that the school system is structured in the UK is extremely punitive towards teachers. The workload is excessive. It's ridiculously stressful. So I didn't last in that, but then that felt like a failure. That felt like, okay, I tried to be a teacher and I failed. And it was quite a delicate point in my life, I suppose. I was 40 years old. I had a small child who was only 18 months old themselves. That's quite a vulnerable time in your life when you're at that the early stages of parenthood, but also just entering your 40s as a woman, particularly. Well, I just felt like I had this massive failure that the teaching hadn't worked out, and I felt like I needed something to succeed, but I also felt like I didn't have many choices. So going back into IT seemed like the only thing I was qualified to do. But this is a very long answer to your question, but you will see why this is relevant. I applied for a job with a company that specialized in taking on graduates, people who were inexperienced. So even though I had 12 years of programming experience, that experience was at least 4 years old, and I didn't think I was coming back into the industry. I'd made no attempts to keep up with technology, and my skills had already been stagnating before I left. So I thought, okay, I'm a blank slate. Let's just start again. Let's pretend I know nothing. Teach me. And also my experience of having been a teacher was that I realized I was extremely jealous of the pupils. I wanted to be learning. And so I was like, okay, this is a good thing. I'm going to start again. I'm going to learn everything from new. And I was excited about it in a way that I'd never really been before. And also I was prepared to put the extra time in. I no longer had the attitude that I had previously had, which was a reasonable attitude, but I don't think it helped me, which is that your job is your job and it doesn't go home with you. It stays at work. When you go home, you're not that anymore. And there's a logic to that in terms of work-life balance, but it did mean that psychologically I saw my work as being something I wasn't really interested in. Whereas in this new world, it also became my hobby. So as well as going to work, I was also going to meetups. And I was actually paying attention to articles about programming and books about programming, and I wanted to know more. And in fact, the company that I was working for did not use agile methodologies, but there were whispers amongst the people there about things like test-driven development and pair programming, and there was some pairing. And so via people I met at work, I started going to meetups, and I discovered XP Manchester, which stands for Extreme Programming Manchester. And I went to some workshops, I did some pairing, I learned about TDD, and that's when I started to get really excited about it. And I took it back to work, and I started to introduce TDD at work in a very small way. I actually tried to design a way of doing SQL programming using TDD, which is probably one of the hardest ways I could try and introduce TDD at work. But I did have some success there. And I didn't stay very long at that company. I moved on to another company where they explicitly talked about TDD, although, to be fair, wasn't a great example of TDD. But by this time, I was really excited about it. So I moved through a series of jobs after that. But all the time, my interest in XP practices grew and grew, and my ability to do them and my ability to evangelize about them at work, and more and more I was joining companies where explicitly these techniques were used and celebrated, until I finally ended up where I am now, where I'm working for a consultancy where we try to help our clients to adopt these practices. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, and it's a really cool story, and I have even more questions coming from this. I think the first one thing that I find with people who have a math background is that math kind of teaches you that there's a problem and you go in a structured way and you find a solution to the problem. And that goes a bit against the TDD approach, which is like, let's iterate. Let's try something, it works or it doesn't. This is more like engineering in the sense that you approximate until you get something that kind of works and kind of does what you want to do. Was it hard for you to switch to test-driven development?
No, and I think that by the time I'd reached that point in my career, my maths degree was a dim and distant memory. So I think, so to be fair, when I started encountering XP, maths was very fresh in my mind because I'd only just come away from being a maths teacher. But I guess I just think about it differently. And I suppose my interest in maths is about patterns. I love patterns. I love seeing patterns. I'm very much a pure mathematician. I've never had any particular interest or aptitude for applied maths. I wish I did, but I don't. I love pure maths. I just like numbers. I really, really like numbers, and I like all of the cool patterns that emerge and all of the amazing ways in which numbers relate to one another. And to me, there's definitely a compatibility there between loving the patterns of numbers and loving the patterns of what you can see in code. And the great thing about TDD is watching those patterns emerge. And I think one of my favorite things about TDD is the ability to test a theory, test an assumption. I think this bit of code will do this. I think this bit of logic will do this. It will have this effect. And instead of having to wait until it's been deployed and I've got a UI and I can interact with the UI and then having to go through a series of steps with the UI to test the thing that I'm trying to test, with TDD, I can write a test instantly and test it before a UI has ever even been constructed. And that also applies to how I think about maths. I'll think, well, I think this might be true. Can I check that it's true? Yes, I can, quickly. And so for me, there's a strong connection there between having ideas about patterns, having ideas about how things might work, and then saying, well, Am I right about this? What about if I do this? That experimental approach, which interestingly as well, I suppose maybe what's relevant here is that I am very, as a teacher, as a high school teacher, I was very much of the school that thinks that you shouldn't teach maths by rote. You shouldn't tell children this is true when it's not obvious to them that it ought to be true. You shouldn't just drill it into them over and over and over. What you should do is give them the opportunity to experiment and explore. And that's what TDD, I think, gives me, is the opportunity to experiment and explore. And so for me, yeah, there's no incompatibility there.
Do you think this is also a matter of the abstract thinking that is developed through maths, and that you can then apply to test-driven development to see these patterns and to see the evolution and so on?
Yeah, and I think also, if you think about it with maths, what you have to be able to do is construct theories and think about how you might prove those theories. And this, I'm not going to lay claims to being an amazing mathematician. I only did an undergraduate degree. It was a long time ago, and when I was teaching maths, I was teaching high school maths. So I was teaching low-level maths. I don't, but I've never forgotten proofs, and proofs were something that I really enjoyed when I was studying my degree in maths. And I think that ability to think abstractly, to construct a test, i.e. construct an idea of what it is that you're trying to demonstrate and prove, and then demonstrate it. I think that is similar to the idea of constructing a mathematical proof.
One thing that I noticed with programmers, I think that many programmers have a difficulty adopting test-driven development, because what we learn in university is that you have a problem, and this is the problem, and it has one solution, and it is the solution, and it works perfectly, and you need to find the solution for the problem always. And this is kind of how it works in university. And then you go into the real world and you realize the problem is not clear, because nobody knows what the problem is actually. So you can only solve just a little bit of it. And so from what you're telling me, it sounds like my assumption is that there are some skills that are underdeveloped in many programmers regarding the problem space, navigating the problem space rather than the solution space, which is things like figuring out which is a smaller problem from a bigger problem, and what are the things that we know and we can actually start working on, and so on. And from what you're telling me, it sounds that somehow you got these skills from your math degree in a way.
You see, I think I wouldn't even say it was necessarily the degree. I have big problems with how maths is taught generally. I guess I have different problems with the way it was taught to me at degree level than I have with the way that it's taught at high school. At degree level, my problem was that it wasn't taught at all. So, typically people who find themselves in positions as lecturers, the reason they're there is because they want to do research. It's not because they want to teach. That's not their main focus. It's just the thing they have to do because those pesky students are there. And in my experience, the way that teaching was done was to just write a bunch of stuff on a blackboard, literally on a blackboard because I'm that old, maybe a whiteboard if we were lucky, but often a blackboard. And then everybody copies it down into their notebooks. I mean, they may as well have just given us handouts, but they didn't mostly. There was no interaction there. We did have tutorials where there was a bit more interaction, but it was just, here's some stuff, just go away and learn it. And I don't think that that's a good way of approaching anything. Again, I want to be able to explore it. And at high school, so this speaks to what you were talking about. If you think people have this idea that there's a problem and a solution, I think this is a massive problem with maths, is that children and people are encouraged to think that there are right answers and wrong answers. And that's what maths is. Maths is a piece of paper with a bunch of questions on it, and you're supposed to say what the answers are, and you either get the right answer or the wrong answer. And unfortunately, most people's experience is that a high proportion of their answers are wrong. and that they feel bad about that, and they get bad results as a result of that, and that makes them have a really bad emotional reaction to maths. And there is an idea amongst everybody, including a lot of teachers, that some people can do it and some people can't. And so if your proportion of wrong answers is high enough, then you get put in the pot of people who can't, which is a horrible feeling. And that's why so many people hate maths, because they didn't know what the answer was and they don't think they can do it, and they'll say, I'm not good at maths. And that's the thing that I got was not from my degree, but was from my father and my whole family. So this is the piece of the puzzle that we haven't mentioned yet. My father is a maths professor. My mother is an ex-maths teacher, also a maths graduate. They met at Cambridge, where they were both doing maths degrees. The whole of my extended family, I have uncles and aunts and cousins who are maths and physics graduates, teachers, and lecturers. So there's a lot of it in my family, and I was brought up to see maths as interesting and exciting and being about solving puzzles. So there were a lot of puzzles in my house, and I was encouraged to solve them. And not only was I encouraged to be excited by maths and to be interested in solving puzzles, also generally my parents were the kind of people who asked a lot of questions and tried to answer questions. So I was encouraged generally in my whole attitude to life to ask questions constantly and to expect people to answer them and not have that embarrassment that I think a lot of people. So for parenting is hard, and for parents who don't consider themselves to be particularly clever, when their children start asking lots of questions, what about this? What about this? Why this? Why that? Parents are tired, they're busy, they feel insecure about the fact that they don't know the answers to these questions. So a really common response is, shut up, ask somebody else. Shut up, just because. Whereas for my parents, it was like, oh, well, I don't, either they knew the answer or I don't know, let's see if we can find out. And they were constantly asking questions themselves. So my understanding of maths was not really what I saw at school or what I got from university. It was what I got from my family, which is that maths is exciting. It's not answers, it's questions. So back to your thing about problems and solutions, it's about problems. It's not about, it is about solutions. You want to try and solve these problems, but the really exciting bit is the asking of the questions and then the exploration to see if you can find what the answers might be. And yes, I do think that in software engineering, if you're not prepared for the fact that there will always be more than one answer, and there isn't actually no such thing as the right answer, then you are going to struggle. And still, having said all of that, I have to confess that I do, because I'm a hyper-focused person, I do have that tendency, which is very common in this industry, is that I will disappear down a rabbit hole because I will go, aha, I'm going in this direction. And off I go, and somebody needs to pull me back again. And that's why collaboration is good, because left to my own devices, I will disappear in the wrong direction for a long time. But when there's somebody else there to say, well, asking questions, then they can go, well, are you sure? But also when I have tests, my tests can help me to keep me on track and make sure, am I solving the problem that I thought I was solving? Combination of tests to help me to work out if I'm solving the right problems, and people to tell me whether I'm solving the problems that I think I'm solving, but people to help me whether I'm even approaching the right problem in the first place. I think that the reason I'm able to do that and I enjoy doing that maybe goes all the way back to having parents who encourage me to ask questions.
Yeah, that mirrors my experience, that I was very, very interested in mathematical problems. Also, there were some books that were presenting mathematical problems as stories, and I was always fascinated about those. And often you wouldn't get a single solution, but you'd get the whole process of getting there, and it was really, really interesting.
Did you come across Martin Gardner?
Yeah,
I think his name. Yeah,
he was one of my favorite authors back then as well.
Yes. So for the benefit of the audience, he wrote books about maths puzzles, lots and lots of really interesting maths puzzles. Anyway, sorry, I interrupted you.
So I like to talk a bit more about collaboration, but before that, let me just go back to something you said, that at some point the job became a hobby. And this is something that strikes me because for me, programming has always been a passion. So even I never think of programming as something that I do at the office and then I leave and then uh, I read articles, I listen to podcasts, I watch videos, while I'm preparing, while I'm cooking or while I'm doing something else. I'm always kind of thinking about some ideas related to programming. And because of that, I cannot always relate to the other side, which I know there are many people who say, okay, programming is a job. I go there, I leave, and I don't have anything against it, but I like to understand it more. So I think your experience here is relevant because you switched from one to another.
So yeah, and I generally in my life find that I'm fighting a constant battle of balance. So I'm trying to get a balance between different sets of interests, for instance. So I do love programming, and I do think about it when I'm not at work. But I also love to play the piano, and I love to read novels, and I love to spend time with the people that I love, and I love to do DIY, and I love to make things, and there are lots and lots of things that I want to do, and I can't do all of them at the same time at any rate. But also, I mean, just, I can't devote as much time to all of these things as I would like. And my solution to, so work-life balance is something that is always on my mind, and I'm always trying to make sure that I'm getting enough rest and I'm getting enough time away from the screen, and that I'm getting enough time pursuing more obviously creative pursuits. I actually think that programming is also a creative pursuit, but things like the piano. And I think that in those first 12 years, I had decided that was, that part of how I would do that is that work was just work, and it was left behind in the office. And it's interesting that how much of that was a positive thing and how much wasn't it. I think initially it started as a positive thing, but unfortunately, because my relationship with my work became less positive, so I became less and less interested in programming and less convinced that I could do it. So more and more insecure about my skills. And I do think gender is relevant here. I never felt like I fitted in. I never felt like I belonged. I was always in male-dominated workplaces. And so what initially was just a way of creating work-life balance actually was really a reflection of the fact that I just didn't enjoy my job, which is a different thing. And now I have made it into my hobby because that was a way of it was two things were served by that. Partly it allowed me to get passionate and excited about my job and actually enjoy the thing that I was being paid to do. But also it did help with progression. So, it helped me move the career in the direction that I wanted it to go. That I wanted to have a more kind of consultative role, and I wanted to be able to think and talk more about XP practices, and I wanted to be able to attend and speak at events. And, the easiest way to get that done was to write talks in my spare time. And this is problematic, you see. This I would absolutely encourage people to get excited about their job to the extent that it could possibly be a hobby. And I think if you can make it be a hobby, you'll find that very rewarding. But what I don't want is a situation where people end up doing unpaid work, or where people work for companies where it is expected that they must work antisocial hours, or that they can't possibly progress in their careers unless they're doing things outside working hours. And it's particularly problematic when you recognise that a lot of people, and the majority of those people are female, but they're not all female, a lot of people have caring responsibilities. The obvious one is when you're parents and you have small children, but people often also look after elderly relatives or people who are unwell and need their care. And those people don't have spare time outside of work. So on the one hand, I want to encourage people to get excited about their work and to have it as a hobby, but I also need to recognize that that's not possible for some people. And what I'm wary of is this idea that it becomes almost mandated. So, for instance, some people, when they're recruiting, they will deliberately filter for people who have GitHub accounts that show that they've been working on projects in their spare time, or people who go to meetups. They're specifically looking for people who go to meetups. And that's that. I can understand why, but what you're not doing there is accounting for the fact that for some people that's not possible. So it is tricky. But my own personal journey, yes, is that by allowing it to become a hobby, it's enriched my daily life. It's meant that my working life is something completely different, because I'm now being paid to do something that I'm passionate about and that I will willingly do in my spare time because I enjoy it so much. Unlike you, though, what I can't do is listen to podcasts about technology while I'm doing other things. I need to focus on it. Because my brain is whirring so much that I generally need to actually have a well, probably not a pen and paper, probably a keyboard in hand, but I need to be able to write notes. I need to be able to pause and stop and think, hang on a minute, what was that? And I can't do that while I'm cooking or doing other things. So I do tend to find that technology podcasts and books and all the rest of it, I have to be absolutely focused on in order to get the most out of it.
Yeah, and that's a very good analysis, and I agree. We were discussing actually before we started that I find it natural that everybody wastes time, and wasting time is a normal and human thing to do, and everybody wastes time differently, and this shouldn't be a problem. You need to relax your brain, you need to read, you need to play piano or whatever you are doing. Spend time with your family, with your kids, cook, whatever you like to do. Other than this,
for lots of reasons. Yeah, partly because your body and mind need rest, and partly because your body and mind need social contact. And those are the things that are not just good for you, but essential. They really do make a difference to your mental and physical health. But partly also because Linda Rising does a great talk about this. That I think she kind of starts from the point of the book of thinking fast, thinking slow, but it's the idea that your brain is still working when you don't realize it's working. So if you think about a problem and then go and do something else, think about something else, what you don't realize is your brain is actually still processing it. So I go for a daily walk every morning before I start work, and I go for a lot of cycle rides, and I often find that I will come up with really useful ideas and solutions while I'm walking or cycling, and I'm not even deliberately trying to think about it. But you need slack. You need to give your brain time to process, but you also need to give yourself permission and forgiveness, and you need to be kind to yourself. And one of the things that I was actually talking with my life coach today about how I approach to-do lists. My brain is full of to-do lists. My brain is full of lists, but I always have there's several different to-do lists, and I'm always worrying about whether I'm going to get all the things. I will tend to assign tasks to a parcel of time. I'll say on Saturday I'm going to do these things, and this evening I'm going to do these things, and I'm nearly, even after years of experience, I'm nearly always overambitious. And I don't do all the things that I thought I was going to do in the time that I allotted for it. And so then the really, really important thing is the ability to say to myself, mañana, I'll do it tomorrow or next week or next month. And the fact that I didn't do it today is not a bad thing. It doesn't mean I'm a bad person. It doesn't mean that I've failed. It just means that my expectations were unrealistic and I need to refine them next time. And it's okay. And if I've had enough, I can stop. I don't have to keep going. I can stop and have a rest and do something else. And if my heart's not in it and I don't want to do it anymore, then I shouldn't be doing it.
Yeah, and also what I noticed in time is I also like books. I've also published books and blog posts and so on. And it seems to me there's a connection between this ability to write and this ability to write code and to program in a way that is easy to understand by other people and to understand the design better, to give better names and so on. So to me, even all these other things that I do, they don't take away from programming. They actually go into my brain, and they kind of group together and come together again when I write code. It's not something that, you don't have to be focused just on programming to get better at programming. And I know you're also an author, so I'm curious about your experience. Do you find any connection between the ability to write well and the ability to write code well?
There are definitely connections in lots of different ways. So I am I mean, I want to say natural. I don't know. Natural is not a very useful word, but I am a communicator. I enjoy communicating. I always have. It's always something that I found that is a skill of mine, and the ability to communicate a story by writing novels is similar to the ability to present. There are definitely connections in terms of presenting information via talking and presentations and communicating with colleagues. So in that sense, they're similar. The understanding the stories are important. The stories make a difference. You probably have noticed that I've been answering your questions. It's been a bit like I've been telling stories. I love to tell stories. If you can think of your story as having a beginning, a middle, and an end, and a narrative shape, that really helps whenever you're presenting information to people. But also there are other connections, like, for instance, one of the things that I've learned from writing novels, which was really hard at first, is what I call the hunk of rock analogy. So I imagine that my first draft that I write is a hunk of rock. So I think of myself as a sculptor. Now, for most people, they find it very hard to create the first draft in the first place. So when people sit down to write, they write a sentence, a paragraph, and are instantly critical. They look at it and they think, well, that's a load of rubbish. And then they get the fear because they think, whatever I write next will probably also be rubbish. And therefore, I don't even want to do it. And that's where I think a lot of the time that's what writer's block is. It's that I'm scared to write the next sentence or paragraph because I think it will be rubbish. And I look at what I've already created, and that was rubbish. I'm rubbish. I can't do this. And then they give up, or they just find it very, very hard and painful and unpleasant. And so what I learned as a novelist, and it took me time, was that what you have to do is see your first draft as something that is supposed to be rubbish. Your first draft is your hunk of rock. So if you're a sculptor, you might look at a hunk of rock and see promise in it, but you don't see a finished product, and you certainly wouldn't present it as a finished product, and you wouldn't be proud of it as a finished product. But the sculptor doesn't look at the hunk of rock and go, oh, that's rubbish. Oh, I'm rubbish. I'm not even going to bother. What they look at is something that has promise. And so what you have to do is create your first draft with your inner critic silenced. Whenever your inner critic pops up and says, this is rubbish, you say, go away. It's supposed to be rubbish. It's fine. It's not a problem. And then you finish the first draft in a novel that might actually be the whole novel, but only in first draft form. And then you say, okay, now my critic is allowed back in. Now I'm allowed to look at this and say that it's rubbish, but not use that as a stick to beat myself with. Say, okay, this is problematic, but I'm now going to fix it. I'm now going to get my chisel out. Now I'm going to do the sculpting. Now I'm going to create the beautiful thing. And I think that it certainly applies as a very direct analogy when you're writing talks or blog posts or articles or presentations. The first draft will be rubbish, and that's okay. It doesn't matter, because then what you do is you edit it. But the same can apply to software as well. That let's get something in front of users. Let's get something out there, and then we can find out if it's fit for purpose. And then we can perfect it. I mean, it's not a straight analogy, because the direct equivalent of the first draft is probably not what goes directly in front of users, but it may well do, depending on how fast your user feedback cycle is. Or it might be that first draft is the thing that gets put against your test, and then your tests help you to refine it. But that idea that you don't have to create perfection with every line of code that you write, or every line of a blog post that you write, that is a really useful principle that I can apply in lots of different spheres. And then the other thing is the business of sculpting and honing and moving pieces around and creating something beautiful. That's, editing is a lot like refactoring. And I don't think you have to be a novelist in order to write good code, but I can see the connection and I can make use of the connection. So yeah. And I mentioned to you before that I think that writing software is creative. I think that writing a good piece of software is just as creative as writing a novel. It's just a different output.
Yeah, and I agree. And I know the advice is write first, edit later. That's one advice for authors that works very well. I also use the same method for some of my books. And when with the last team that we had, the last product team, we had a mantra that was first make it work, then clean it up, then measure performance, and only then, if needed, improve performance.
Yes. Martin Fowler makes a really good point about that in his refactoring book, that I constantly repeating to people, that when you're writing code, because software engineers love to do this. Software engineers love to get really, really into NP, like P, I forgot what it's called, but complexity. What is the complexity of this code, and constantly thinking about is it efficient? So worrying about how many for loops they have and whether they're efficient or not, and spending ages tweaking it to make it as efficient as it can possibly be. And what they don't realize is that this particular routine that they've spent ages crafting to be efficient only gets run a handful of times. And you're talking about milliseconds of difference, and in the overall performance of the system makes no difference at all. So, and if you ask software engineers which bits of their code are going to most impact performance, they're nearly always wrong. And so I'm not saying don't think about it, but actually your first priority. So what people do is they optimize the efficiency of their code to the detriment of readability and maintainability. So they bring it down to one line of code, which is very, very clever and possibly more efficient than the alternative, but completely unreadable and therefore unmaintainable. And actually, if you write the code, and as you said, and then tweak it and then measure performance, you'll find that the bottlenecks are nowhere near the bits of code that you thought they would be. And you could waste a lot of effort and make your code less maintainable for the sake of something that's not even impacting on performance in the way that you thought it would.
Yeah. Now I need to qualify this. If you're a C++ programmer watching this who's doing like high frequency trading, then you have a whole different problem than people building web applications or cloud applications and stuff like that. So there are classes of problems, but in like 90 or 80% of software this applies. So I noticed that you also talk about clean architecture and solid principles. And I'm curious what you teach about those, or what are your views? Why are these things important in code?
Yeah, it's really interesting actually, because solid principles, the S, the O, the L, the I, and the D, I have a little crib sheet which I always have to consult. I can never, or very rarely off the top of my head, remember what they all stand for and what they mean, particularly when we get to list off. That's when, hang on a minute, let me just check my notes again. But when you start talking about, I can't even remember the name of it, but there are some various principles like buried down within list off that I always have to look up. But For me, what we're talking about with solid, what we're talking about is good object-oriented design. So we're talking about understanding how to modularize your code, how to break it down into components that will communicate and behave well together, so that your code is maintainable, and so that also it's easy to define and maintain boundaries. And that also for me is what clean architecture is all about. I want to be able to have a plug and play paradigm. I want to be able to swap out different elements of my code without affecting other elements. I want to be able to fit it in my head. So I want to be able to look at any one component of a system at different levels and understand what I'm looking at. So I might look at a class and just at its public interface, and from that know what that class is for, and not have to understand the exact detail of every single implementation of each element of that interface. And then I want to look at an implementation of one part of an interface, and it itself might be broken down into several different functions, but I want to always be able to look at one function and understand what that function does without necessarily having to know the detail behind each line of code. And for me, what clean architecture and what solid does for me is the ability to break my system down into digestible chunks that can play with each other, that I can understand the messaging and the relationships between those components and how they communicate and interact with one another, and that I can understand that, and so can somebody else. And if you're using good object-oriented principles and you're using good clean architecture, then that should be the case. And with clean architecture, you're obviously you're kind of taking a wider view. You're looking at your system as a whole, and you're saying, well, which bit of this system is responsible for interacting with the user, and which bit of this system is responsible for interacting with the database, and can I just worry about that bit without having to think about that bit? And can I get one person to just look at that bit without having to think about that bit? And can I get one person to work on that bit while somebody else is working on that bit, and not trip each other up constantly? And with a good clean architecture and with good solid principles, that is what you hopefully achieve. So for me, it's actually all about getting to the situation where people only have to think about small chunks of things, and they don't have to deal with masses of complexity. And acknowledging, because I think there is a temptation sometimes in this industry for us to think that the people who are really good at the job are the people who can hold vast quantities of complexity in their brain all at one time. And those are the people that we should be bowing down to. And it's amazing when people can do it. I mean, I do bow down to it. I think it's incredible. But realistically, most of us can't do that. And even those of us who can't do it all the time. And we're not doing anybody any favors if we deliberately aim to have systems that can only be understood by people who can hold vast amounts of complexity in their brain all at one time. We should always be aiming to design our systems in such ways that people who have hangovers, people who are tired, people who are able to think about the broad picture can look at this and understand it, and don't have to be constantly dealing with vast quantities of complexity.
Yeah, this matches my experience in that I learned early on that while I can hold a lot of abstraction in my head and a lot of things, it's still limited, so it's best if I can focus on one thing, do it well, and then have the ability to zoom in and zoom out. And I think this is one of the hardest things to get. I don't know if there's any training to do that. It's quite hard to. It comes with experience. So.
Yeah. I don't know if there's any training for that. The way that I bring it into people when I'm teaching is by talking about, being able to pull your system apart into separate components and think about how those components interact with each other, being able to take a wider view and a deeper view. But specifically training people how to do that. I think one of the things that I really love about the Agile community is that we share with each other lots of different workshopping paradigms and tools and diagramming paradigms and tools. You know, the whole all of the stuff that Matthew Skelton does, and you know, all of the different ways we have of visualizing and representing systems in different ways and different contexts and at different times, all the different kinds of mapping that can be done. I think all of those things are all tools that we're using to be able to zoom out and zoom in. And we maybe don't talk enough about the fact that that is what we're doing. You know, but I always try to encourage people to use different mapping tools, different workshopping tools, to draw diagrams. Please draw diagrams. And that's been much harder in this remote world. But you know, take a step back. And I have to remind myself as well, because I am a focused, detail-oriented person. So I have to constantly, and that's why I need other people to remind me, Claire, take a step back. Have you taken a step back? Have you looked at what you're doing and why you're doing it?
Yeah, I've come to the conclusion, you know, there's a saying that comes from, I think from art. It says the medium is the message. And I think we haven't really understood it yet in software programming, because we are looking at linear text for most of the time. We don't realize that that is not the message actually, but we see that medium, and therefore the message gets linear and that's why I believe that it's quite hard for many people to imagine what it means to evolve software, or to imagine these various moving parts in a code. That's why we have so many challenges with modularity, which is still not a solved problem in software, despite discussing about it for, I don't know, 50 years or so. So yeah, it's quite... and the solution would be to come up with various ways of looking at the code. So I like this idea of having different views of the system rather than only the text.
I don't know if you've come across a guy called Tudor Gerber, who is working on creating a tool that will allow people to I can't remember, because it's a while. I first came across him because he was interviewed by Jessica Kerr on the Greater Than Code podcast. I think it was her who interviewed him, and he has been, I think, developing a tool that attempts to generate diagrams from code, but also attempts to encourage people to not see code as just linear and not see code as just text, because text is just the way that we experience it. That's not what code actually is. So he's very much trying to encourage people to think of code diagrammatically, to view it diagrammatically, to be able to drill down into detailed diagrams and then come back to a higher level. So it was a while ago that I listened to the podcast, but I think that's what he was talking about, this fact that we tend to interact with our code as though it was text, and that's just how we represent it. It's just a medium. It's not what it is.
Yeah, I think I got in touch with him actually on Twitter, and I plan to take a look at his tool because it looks very interesting. You mentioned collaboration on a number of occasions, and I like to go back to this part, because we talked a bit about the technical aspects of software development, but there are also the human aspects, collaborating with other people, pair programming, but not only pair programming, all these having teams that work in a nice culture that allows them to grow, and all these kind of things. And you mentioned initially pair programming and how it was very weird to you as a concept in the beginning. How was your first experience actually pair programming with somebody?
I think my first experience was at a day-long workshop organised by XP Manchester, which was split into something like 4 sections, and in each section we were in a different pair, so we were circulating the pairs, and we were approaching the same problem repeatedly using test-driven development. So we were throwing the code away after each attempt and starting again.
Code retreat?
Yes. Yeah. And I'd never done anything like that before, and I was being paired with a different person every time. And at first, I felt quite at sea, because they were moving quite fast. Some of the languages I wasn't familiar with, some of the concepts I wasn't familiar with, wasn't really sure what was going on. But as the day wore on, I recognised that I could contribute and that there was no judgment, but that also by being so close to somebody else's code and approach, I could see that they were not as proficient as I would have assumed they were. So my default assumption would tend to be everybody else except me knows what they're doing. And by being right next to somebody, you see, oh, okay, they don't know what they're doing either. And the more I did of pairing, the more I realised that, first of all, it's helpful to have somebody to bounce ideas off. That previously I had a tendency to get stuck and then be too embarrassed to ask for help, and not want to bother people, not want to interrupt people, get more stuck, get more embarrassed to ask for help, because the more stuck I got, the more I would have to, when I finally did ask for help, admit how long I'd been stuck for. And by having somebody next to me that I was collaborating with, I could straight away say I'm stuck. But not only that, I could see that they were sometimes stuck too. And that it wasn't just me that was Googling for solutions every 5 minutes or forgetting what things meant. And sometimes I would know something that they didn't know, and I would be able to help them. And that was when it actually ended up being a massive, initially, and I think this is true for a lot of people, initially it made me feel insecure because I felt a bit lost. But very quickly it had the opposite effect. It helped to boost my confidence because I was able to see that I wasn't alone.
That's very interesting because you probably don't know, but me and our CEO and founder, Maria Diacono, we facilitated the first code retreat outside US, and then actually helped codify the current format, which is used around the world. And it's always so interesting to me to hear experiences of participants, and I often hear precisely this, that it's kind of weird, which we know it is very weird, but by the end you realize that something has changed. You realize that you can learn from other people, or that there are some more techniques that you can try, or that, no, as you say, nobody knows everything, and so you collaborate, and it's so interesting. And then coming back to collaboration, you mentioned a lot of times how you tend to go into a lot of details and you need people to drag you back. And how does this happen for you, and how do you make it happen? Let's say.
Well, I'm getting much better at recognizing when it happens. So, if I'm not sometimes you might not be working directly with somebody else, or you might have split up. So if I am working individually, then I will recognize that I am disappearing down. I'm on my way into a rabbit hole. And at that point, I now will say, oh, okay, I need to go and ask somebody else's opinion here. I need checks and balances. But if I'm directly pairing with somebody, then one of the things that I'll try to do is establish almost like a code of conduct. Let's agree with one another lots of things. In fact, let's agree that if either one of us ever wants a break, that we always feel confident to say so. And let's make sure we take them anyway. Let's actually build that into our rhythm, that we do take regular breaks. Let's set a timer to make sure that we take regular breaks. And let's be confident and comfortable about saying to one another, this is something that I need some really strong focus and concentration, and I need to go off on my own for a short period of time. But also, let's agree that if either one of us is ever questioning why we're doing what we're doing, that we also, it's okay to say, hang on a minute, you seem to have been tugging at this thread for a while now, or we seem to have been tugging at this thread for a while now. Why? Are we sure that we're still on the right track? But also, you know, as pairs, you can end up going down the same rabbit hole together. You can actually encourage each other to go herring off in the wrong direction. So it's also a good idea to make sure that, you know, if only by means of a daily stand-up, that you're checking in with the rest of your team about what you're doing, so that, you know, so that the two of you can get dragged back if you go off too far in one direction.
Okay. And how about other types of collaboration? We talked about pair programming, but if you think about the teams that you work with or that you work in, are there any other types of collaboration that you use often?
Oh, yes. I mean, I'm always very keen in the teams that I'm working in. So there are a few things. I mean, the obvious one is that I'll always want to have regular team-based ceremonies. So one of the most important things for me is the retrospective. And interestingly, I interviewed Ina Corrie just the other week for our podcast about her book, Retrospectives, Anti-Patterns. And I realised from having spoken to her and also from starting to read the book that I am, or actually have been, woefully complacent in the retrospectives that I've been facilitating. And we could do a lot of work in improving our retrospectives and the effectiveness of them. But I do think that the retrospective is an incredibly important tool for lots of reasons, because it encourages that idea that never assume that you're doing things in the best possible way. There's always room for improvement. It's always good to ask questions. It's okay to ask questions. It's okay to say, you know what, this didn't go brilliantly. Maybe we could have done it better. But it's also really important to celebrate your successes. To say this is going really well. We're doing a really good job here. Let's celebrate that and recognise it and call it out. So, and the retrospective isn't the only format for that, but I think, particularly in these remote times, what you need to do as teams, in order to function effectively, you need to be regularly communicating with one another so that you know what you're doing, so that you can course correct, but also so that you can form strong bonds of trust. Because the more you trust one another, and the better you know one another, then the more likely it is that you will communicate effectively and work together effectively. So the other thing that's really important for me is, for instance, deliberately creating space for chat. And again, particularly in these online times, at the start and the end, or the end of meetings, deliberately having little games that you play, deliberately creating exercises that allow you to get to know one another beyond just the confines of the work that you're achieving together. And I think, you know, and thinking of people as human beings. So, I mean, there are lots of things, but having regular one-to-ones with everybody in your team, and not just obviously work-focused one-to-ones, but having regular just coffee chats. You know, we have systems that randomly put people together in pairs so that they can have coffee together. So we have one of those across the whole company, and we have another in the Manchester region. It's called Donut. It's a Slack add-on thing. But also, you know, making empathy a conscious, explicitly discussed thing, that we are always trying to see things from the other person's point of view, and we're trying not to fall into tribal mentalities of us and them. we're trying not to demonize individuals or groups. The prime directive, we believe that everybody was doing the best job they possibly could with the tools that they had at hand. Talking about understanding one another, paying attention to one another, talking explicitly about diversity and how different people have different experiences, and some people are disadvantaged and need extra help and consideration, talking about being allies to people who are disadvantaged. All of those things make a difference to a team's ability and a company's ability to operate effectively. There was something else. Oh, feedback. So having a feedback culture. So encouraging everybody, and this is something that needs constant work. You can never be complacent about this, and it's difficult. It takes time to build a feedback culture where you're encouraging everybody to both give and receive. So give and request, offer and request feedback, and to understand how to do that effectively, so that people aren't made to feel bad by it, so that people understand that you're doing it to help them, so that you focus on positive things as well as constructive things, that you find ways to praise people, and you find ways to amplify the good as well as to help them to improve, and how to receive feedback, how to always thank people and take it on board, but also that both as a giver and the receiver of feedback, you don't have to agree with it. If you give feedback, you can't assume that the person you give it to will act on it, because that's their business. And it's not about you being right and them being wrong. It's about you letting them know how their actions have impacted you or the work that you're doing. And then it's up to them what they do with that. And that when you receive feedback, again, you don't have to take it on board, but it is good if you acknowledge it and thank people for it, and give yourself time to let it sink in and consider it rather than just rejecting it outright. So yeah, I could talk about it for hours, but there are so many different ways, things that we can do to enhance collaboration within and between teams.
And on this note, we are getting close to the end. So, because you told so many interesting stories and with such a storytelling talent that we haven't even felt the time passing. Now, in the end, I like to use 6 questions that we ask everybody participating in this channel. So I'll continue with those. First question is, what book did you like and would recommend to people?
Oh, well, that's not hard at all, actually. Now, I have to confess, normally that would be hard, and the reason it would be hard is because I actually struggle to read non-fiction. Fiction is fine, but I think we probably won't talk about that. I have a million novels that I could recommend. Non-fiction, I struggle to maintain my attention. And I rarely finish them, and I'm embarrassed to admit it, but it's true. So I'm sure, and I know I'm not the only one. But I think that there is a non-fiction book which I've just finished reading, which I absolutely had no trouble finishing and would heartily recommend. Partly because and I think the reason that I managed to finish it is partly because it's an amazing book, but also because I consumed it as an audio book. And I've recently, in the last year, started listening to a lot of podcasts, and I've discovered that audiobooks are so much easier for me to consume. They're problematic in some ways because I can't easily search them and check back. And so I ended up buying a physical copy of the book to go with the audiobook so that I could go back and check things. But the book is Why We Sleep by Matthew Walker. And it's not obviously a technology book, but that still I would say everybody should read it, because I think it's incredibly important to this industry and all industries. And what Matthew Walker does is go into an absolute polemic about how underrated sleep is in our society and how incredibly important it is. Much more important than you thought. I'm sure most people know that sleep is important, but unless you've read this book, it's probably more important than you realise. It impacts on physical health and mental health and life and death in so many ways. And it is not given the importance that it deserves in so many ways, from simple things to how many road traffic accidents are caused by lack of sleep, how many deaths are caused by lack of sleep purely on the roads, but also in hospitals, in jobs. That and again, it is not uncommon in this industry for us to be encouraged to work long hours and not get enough sleep. And what I've discovered, and I've mentioned it, I think, that I'm a person who always has millions of to-do lists, always trying to squeeze more things into my life. So previously I was somebody who would allow sleep to fall by the wayside just so that I could have more hours in my day to do all of the million things that I was trying to do. Since I've read the book, I now get 8.5 hours in bed religiously every night. And so that's a lot less time available to me to do all the things that I think that I want to do with my time. And yet I'm not less productive, I'm more productive, because the impact on my physical, mental well-being and my energy levels is so enormous. And it'll lengthen my life. It'll make me less likely to die of a whole bunch of horrible things. So read the book. And the funny thing is that this book had been recommended to me by lots of people before I read it, and it took me about 3 years, I think, from the first recommendation, possibly longer, to get round to reading it. And it was because I knew that as soon as I read it, I was going to have to change my sleeping habits, and I didn't want to, because I didn't want to lose hours in my day. But the irony is that I might have lost physical hours, but I haven't lost it. And I've gained so much energy and so much motivation that it's absolutely been worth it. So everybody read that book.
Thank you. I've heard of the book, and I'm also fascinated by neuroscience and behavioral psychology, so I keep reading about this stuff. I know around the topic a lot of things, and I know about sleep. Yeah, I sleep 8 hours a day.
Good. Well done. Good for you. Everybody should follow that example.
Second question: what category of books you don't read too much, and why?
Okay. Because I mean, I do read, or at least half. Oh, hang on. I'm just going to wait for that phone to stop ringing. Sorry, I don't need to answer it. I just need it to stop ringing, which it will any minute. Surely somebody's going to answer it. Come on. There you go. So, books that I don't read. You know what? I actually have attempted a few times to read graphic novels and found it really hard. I understand. Because originally I did what a lot of people did, and just they're just comics. They're not proper fiction. But then a bunch of people who knew better explained to me that there's a lot more to it than that. There's some beautiful art and there are some really well told stories. And I don't know what it is. I can't get my head. I can't get pulled in. I don't know if it's that the pictures are distracting, or that I don't particularly like the style of art that is used in graphic novels. But yeah, I really struggle with it. I have a similar problem with poetry as well. I actually like poems if they catch me at exactly the right moment, which normally means somebody has to be reciting it, and then I'll appreciate it. But opening a book of poetry, but there's nothing happening. Like, why? I can't persuade myself to get engaged.
That's very interesting. Third question: what topic do you think is not discussed enough in the industry or community, in software industry?
Sleep.
What topic do you think is discussed too much in the industry or in community?
Wow. Too much. Gosh. That is a really hard question. Is there anything I would like people to shut up about? I honestly, I can't think of anything.
Okay.
Yeah, I don't know. I personally, although having said before that I like to get lost in detail, I am not interested in exactly how this piece of software works. I do not want to read a manual of how to do A, B, C, D, and E with this one particular tool. I want to know about the broader principles. I want to know about what problems it's solving. That's the best thing I can think of that I'm like, yeah, like stop
Okay.
going on about the exact. And on social media, on Twitter, for instance, if somebody's kind of writes a big long thread about a very specific technology, I'm just like, unless I happen to be using that exact technology right now to solve a particular problem and I think you can help with that, I'm like, no, I'm sorry, no, not interested.
What would be your ultimate career achievement? Something that if you do, you would think that you are ready to retire.
Well, um, I don't know if I'd be ready to retire. I'd probably want to do more of it. But certainly, I would absolutely love, and this is just hands down, I have to confess, I love an audience. So if I could keynote, and I don't even have a particular event in mind, but if I could keynote at an event that had thousands of people in the audience, which actually, the closest I got, and it probably is one of my biggest achievements so far, was speaking at Lead Dev London, where there were 1,300 people in the audience at the Barbican. Just being at the Barbican is such an iconic building. But yeah, keynoting to thousands of people, that would be pretty cool. And then, but I think I might be able to retire if I wrote a book, and I don't know what that book's going to be, but if it was a book that everybody said, that's the book that you should read because it's so useful and insightful. If you don't read any other book, just read that one book by Clare Sudbery because you'll learn so much and it'll be so useful. And it blew my mind when I read it. Now, if I could write that book, maybe I'd be able to retire after that, but probably not because I probably just want to go around talking about it.
Yeah, of course. That's one of the things with this question. Everybody tells me, yeah, this is some, but then I would do something else because it's so cool.
Yeah.
What advice would you give to a younger version of yourself?
Oh, please stop worrying. It's all right. It's okay. You're nowhere near as rubbish as you think you are. You don't need to know all of those things. And all of those people that you think know all of those things, they don't know all of those things. Nobody does. Nobody knows all the things. Everybody's insecure, and if they're not, then that's really good, and be pleased for them. But most people are insecure. Most people are just as worried as you are. Most people think they're rubbish and that they don't know what they're doing. And you never will know what you're doing. You're always going to be confused. But rather than thinking that that is a problem, celebrate it, embrace it. Being confused, turn it on its head. Whenever you feel confused about something, think about it as an opportunity to learn something new and get excited about something new. Being confused is part of the job, and it's all right. Every aspect of confusion is just another opportunity to learn something new.
All right, this was all the 6 questions. Before we close, is there anything that we haven't talked about that you'd like to share with our audience?
Oh well, I mean, obviously, we mentioned it very briefly, but I work for Made Tech, and we have together just created a brand new podcast. I am the host or hostess. I don't. It's funny. Neither of those words sounds quite right, but I am the person who interviews people, and mostly has kind of creative control over the content. So in each episode, I interview a new person. We've only just launched, so there are only 5 episodes. We launched with 4, and then we published a new one today. But so far, there are interviews with Jessica Kerr, Paula Paul, John Skeet, Kit Collingwood, and Dave Rogers. We've got episodes coming up with Anne Maria Maffedon, with Esther Derby, with Kevlin Henney, and I know Corrie that I mentioned briefly. I'm just so enjoying putting it together. I love asking questions. So interviewing all of these fantastic people who are so knowledgeable. I always learn something new in every episode. The podcast is called Making Tech Better, and it is available on all the major podcast platforms. Please do listen, subscribe, write reviews, tell everybody, share, tell your friends. But I've really been enjoying making it. I would love for people to listen.
Yeah, I understand. All these conversations increase my energy as well. It's really cool to have them. Where can people find you?
They can find me on Twitter is the easiest place. It's Clare Sudbery, and it's probably not spelt how you think. So Clare has no I in it, Clare, and Sudbery is spelt ERY at the end. So think of surgery, which is also spelt ERY at the end. And then you'll probably be able to find me. Nobody else spells their name that. There are other Clare Sudberys in the world, but I'm pretty sure that there is no other Clare Sudbery in the whole world that spells her name the same way as me. So I get to use my name as my username and as a domain name and as everything. It's always just Clare Sudbery.
Right, perfect. Clare, this has been an absolute pleasure. Very interesting conversation. Thank you for participating.
Thank you. There've been some wonderful questions. I've really enjoyed it. So thank you for having me on.
Okay, and I hope all of you have enjoyed this conversation. We talked about a lot of interesting things, and I feel like we could talk even more about, particularly about the let's say the soft skill aspects, which are sometimes the hardest parts of the job.
Yeah.
And we have to pay our dues to the YouTube algorithm, so please share, like, subscribe, comment, tell other people about this channel if you enjoyed it, and I really hope you come back and listen to other interesting conversations. We got one every week usually, unless something really strange happens, but we try to get once a week consistently. And until next time, remember to think, design, and work smart.